Hello and welcome everyone to the Fate of the Union podcast, a weekly review of the biggest issues in national politics given from a conservative perspective. The show will also periodically address current true crime cases from across the country. Fate of the Union is hosted by Franklin Joseph, a lawyer and constitutional conservative. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also learn more about the show and its host on Twitter at FranklinFOTU. Now, let's talk about the fate of the Union. Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the Fate of the Union podcast. As always, I am your host, Franklin Joseph, and in this week's episode of Fate of the Union, we'll be tackling some issues surrounding policing in America and the popularized accusations of racism against blacks in the country under our current policing system. This episode is produced mainly in response to the recent police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the subsequent advocacy, protests, rioting, and the overall narrative proposed by the mainstream media in response. The date of recording for this episode is Friday, May 29th, 2020. Let's first start with a primer that reviews the case of George Floyd. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. On Monday night, an employee at a Minneapolis grocery store called the police after Floyd allegedly tried to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. In a widely circulated cell phone video of the subsequent arrest, Floyd, who is black, can be seen on the ground with his hands cuffed behind his back, while Officer Derek Chauvin presses him to the pavement with his knee on Floyd's neck. The video shows Chauvin, who is white, holding Floyd down for several minutes as Floyd complains he can't breathe. The video ends with paramedics lifting a limp Floyd onto a stretcher and placing him in an ambulance. In the wake of the publishing of this video and the public's education on what happened in this confrontation, 4 officers who responded to the scene were fired the next day. On Wednesday, Mayor Jacob Frey called for Chauvin to be criminally charged. However, Frey made no mention of the other 3 officers who were also at the scene. On Thursday morning, May 28th, the U.S. Justice Department also announced that it is going to make a federal investigation into George Floyd's death, a quote top priority for the Bureau. So that's where this case currently stands. 4 officers were fired, and there appears to be an ongoing investigation into Floyd's death by both state and federal authorities that will help form the charges against at least Officer Chauvin and perhaps some, if not all, of the other 3 responding police officers. Now, obviously, this case contains video, which is quite useful in analyzing the case against the responding officers. Many times in the past, videos of police shootings or police killings have been published but begin depicting the confrontation between officer and citizen after the physical altercation has already started. Thus, the viewer does not see the moments leading up to the engagement between the 2 subjects. This can sometimes pose difficulties, especially early on in the case, in determining what, if any, probable cause the officer had for engaging the citizen. Here, however, the video is quite long, being about 8 minutes in length. Also, we can hear Floyd's voice along with the voice of several bystanders contemporaneously claiming that Floyd was having trouble breathing. In sum, the video in this case appears to accurately and completely depict the encounter between Floyd and the officers. Moreover, we also know that the officers were responding to claims that Floyd was allegedly trying to pass off fraudulent bills. There have been reports that perhaps there was some kind of fraudulent or a scheme to pass off food stamps inside the convenience store in question. This is relevant in that we know that the officers were not responding to the scene of a violent crime or engaging with someone who had been posing a danger to others. Instead, we seem to have a man who knowingly or unwittingly attempted to pay for goods with fraudulent bill or fraudulent food stamps. I think the available evidence not only justifies the firing of the four officers, but also necessitates an upcoming grand jury in the case of Officer Chauvin. Now, perhaps there will be a grand jury like those upcoming in the Ahmaud Arbery case, which we discussed in a previous episode, in which the state prosecutor's office will determine what charges are the most appropriate. Regardless, all signs indicate that the most likely outcome, based on the available evidence that we have right now, is that in the relatively short term, we will see a grand jury proceeding and see certain charges formed around the prosecution of at least Officer Chauvin. For now, Chauvin would likely stand trial for a murder charge related to the use of excessive force on George Floyd. Now, in the wake of the video circulating online, we saw an outcry of many sentiments popularized throughout the political left and the mainstream media, of course, repeating myself there. These claims, as I'm sure you are aware, is that George Floyd's death is symptomatic of a racist police force in America and a racist criminal justice system, more broadly speaking. But what lens should one look at in order to make a solid conclusion regarding these claims? On a related note, what statistics or cases should be examined in making an assessment as to the truthfulness of these claims? Let's start most broadly in the statistics concerning annual deaths per year by police shootings. Police shootings are often cited as the most common type of deadly force used by the police when engaging with a suspect, certainly when engaging with a black suspect. So although there may be cases such as the Eric Garner case several years ago and the George Floyd case now, if we look at police shootings specifically, that can give us at least an accurate overview of what the state of policing is in terms of the use of deadly force when engaging with suspects in general and black suspects more specifically. After looking at the annual deaths per year by police shootings, from there we can break down the number of police shootings deaths annually by race. Finally, we can examine the number of deaths in the black community resulting from police shootings in a variety of circumstances. All in all, from there, we can better ascertain whether the officers in these cases were justified in using deadly force against these black suspects, and what the overall view of use of deadly fatal force is when American police officers engage black suspects. Now, the Washington Post has a comprehensive and very user-friendly database that compiles the cases of police shootings in America each year. The database launched in 2015 when the Washington Post began to log every fatal shooting by an on-duty police officer in the United States. Within the database, the Post allows users to break down the number of shootings, by which state they occurred in, whether the suspect in question was armed, and if so, what weapon he or she had on them, whether the suspect was fleeing a crime scene, and importantly for this discussion, what race the suspect was. Here, let's examine the numbers from 2019, since that is obviously the most recent year in which we have a full 12 months of data. Doing so will also allow us to account for any developments in these cases since the shooting first occurred. The Washington Post database reports that 1,014 people were shot by on-duty police officers during 2019. As context, it notes, quote, Despite the unpredictable events that lead to fatal shootings, police nationwide have shot and killed almost the same number of people annually, near or around 1,000, since the Post began its project in 2015. The Washington Post also asserts, correctly I think, that, quote, probability theory may offer an explanation. It holds that the quantity of rare events in huge population tends to remain stable absent major societal changes, such as a fundamental shift in police culture or extreme restrictions on gun ownership, end quote. And I think that's particularly accurate here because, broadly speaking, you're dealing with a country of over 330 million people. Even if you break it down by race, you're still dealing with a population size of tens of millions of people scattered across various states, with various policing procedures, different leaders of police departments, obviously different judicial systems when we're concerning state crimes across the country. So I think the probability theory underlying the explanation of how the number of people fatally shot by police can come in such a consistent number, I think that probability theory is accurate and a justifiable explanation for why we see such a similar number every year. For our purposes here, let's first get a breakdown of the total police shootings on black suspects for 2019, and then we'll look at the shootings on black suspects for that year versus white suspects during the same year. Since the broad-based theories grounded in the illusory concepts of institutional racism necessarily denotes that the presence of black suspects in these statistics wrongly outnumbers the presence of white suspects in these statistics, the general breakdown of race per race and then comparing that to the representation that each race has in the overall US population will help elucidate the truthfulness to some of these claims. Generally speaking, although half of the people shot and killed by police are white, black Americans are shot at a disproportionate rate. They account for around 13% of the US population, but are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. Now, importantly, this of course does not account for why any given suspect was in a deadly confrontation with police in the first place. It also doesn't comment on each individual's cases of the suspect's conduct, the officer's conduct, any criminal history, or assessments of probable cause. These qualifications only note that the deadly confrontation occurred without commentary on what the suspect or officer were doing at the time. In 2019, 235 blacks were shot and killed by the police. In contrast, 370 whites were shot and killed by the police. It must be absolutely stressed that, again, these numbers simply state the number of deaths at the hands of police by firearm according to the race of the suspect. These numbers do not account for conduct of either suspect or officer, nor do they assess determination of probable cause of criminality by any of the officers involved. Nevertheless, we see that according to representation of each race within the total US population, blacks are indeed overrepresented in these statistics. However, let's take a closer look at the 235 deaths in the black community we just noted. Within the database, the Post also allows you to further break down the numbers to account for the suspect being armed at the time of the deadly encounter with the police. Here, out of the 235 black suspects shot and killed by the police in 2019, 152 of them, or over 50% of them, were armed with a gun. 31 of those suspects were armed with a knife. 18 were, quote, armed with a vehicle, meaning they were operating a vehicle in a manner capable of striking and harming others. 5 suspects had a, quote, toy weapon, That's what you see a lot of times in Bureau of Justice statistics. The Washington Post database uses the toy weapon term at several points in both their commentary and in their statistics page. This is basically the Tamir Rice case. The individual in question was in possession of a fake gun, and each case presented its own facts on whether the fake gun realistically appeared to be a genuine weapon, and whether it was being used as a decoy to appear as a legitimate weapon as well. Furthermore, 12 blacks were shot and killed by police while armed with what the Post terms as, quote, other weapons. A review of the case included in this category shows that these cases involved suspects handling weapons such as tasers, knives or blades, a blunt object, or any combination of these objects. Next, we see that 8 suspects are listed as, quote, unknown regarding their possession of a weapon. Since this was unknown at the time of the shooting, and 8 instances are not statistically relevant, we will put these aside for the purposes of this exercise. Finally, we see that a total of 9 unarmed blacks were shot and killed by police in 2019. Not 900, nor 9,000. One less than 10. 9 unarmed black people were shot and killed by police over the course of the 365 days in 2019. For further context, there are currently almost 45 million blacks in the U.S., according to current U.S. Census website estimates. This category is relevant because on the off chance one is ever met with a degree of specificity from the institutional racism crowd regarding police shootings, many times there is an emphasis placed on unarmed blacks in particular. But judging from the numbers, the police shootings of unarmed black people in America for the 2019 calendar year accounted for the deaths of approximately 0.00002% of the black population in the country at large. The difference of opinion on the subject of blacks killed by police, or more specifically unarmed blacks killed by police, by those on the political left, on the Black Lives Matter side of the debate, and on the opposing side, can be summed up and delineated by a few select questions. For example, at what point do the number of instances of police shootings of black suspects turn from simply a certain number of events into a nationwide crisis facing the black community? More broadly speaking, how many instances of a certain event need to happen in a specified period of time where the event goes from simply a repeated instance to a nationwide threat against the particular community? If we further look into the statistics, things such as being struck and killed by lightning in a population of 330 million people in the country would not pose a sufficient threat where anyone would say that the country at large or any specific population is under a nationwide threat of that deadly occurrence. I would submit that the 2/100,000th of a percentage of blacks killed by police while unarmed falls drastically short of even a charitable interpretation of what would pose a nationwide threat to the black community. Moreover, a supposedly deadly threat to a population that falls well short of killing 1% of that population, when that population totals some 45 million people across the country, is not a nationwide issue at all. To say otherwise would be ignorant of the statistics and thus inflate the overall nationwide threat to the black community by police officers and fatal shootings. This, of course, goes without saying that the numbers that we talked about today in this episode cover both legally justifiable and legally unjustifiable police shootings. By all available data, more than half of police shootings are legally justified. Officers have legal justification to use deadly force when they themselves or the community at large in the surrounding area is posed with a deadly threat by the suspect. The suspect can be posing a deadly threat, again, by either a firearm, in cases of a vehicle, in cases of knives or blades, and even some blunt objects. There have been some cases, not in police shootings, but in one posing a deadly threat to another citizen, in which a full wine bottle was determined to be using deadly threat because the subject in question hit the victim in the temple with a wine bottle. And certainly such a blunt force from a significantly heavy object can cause, at the very least, brain damage and could result in death. Also, in the wake of George Floyd's death, we saw a violent uprising and riots in Minneapolis in protest of the killing. While many of the individuals were peacefully protesting, several videos have surfaced showing swaths of blacks in Minneapolis looting stores, especially a Target store, lighting stores on fire, and even lighting the local precinct on fire. There was also significant damage to other stores and cop cars in the area. Now, many public figures on the political left were quick to justify these actions, and at the most characterized them as many public figures on the political left were quick to justify the riots, the looting, and the arson, and at most characterized these actions as personally disagreeable, but all in all not inexcusable, given, again, the illusory threat of the police force at large against the black community in America. Officers eventually showed up in riot gear and started firing tear gas, flash grenades, and rubber bullets as protesters hurled rocks, water bottles, and anything they can get their hands on towards the officers. Thankfully, during a press conference on Thursday, May 28th, Minneapolis Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins, an African-American woman herself, called for a calm and peaceful demonstration and admonished rioters for hurting the, quote, very communities that you say you are standing up for. Jenkins continued, quote, today is a sad day for Minneapolis. It's a sad day for America. It's a sad day for the world. I want to remind all the people that are in the streets that are protesting. You have every absolute right to be angry, to be upset, to be mad, to express your anger. However, you have no right to perpetrate violence and harm on the very communities that you say that you are standing up for. We need peace and calm in our streets, and I am begging you for that calm, end quote. Frankly, the looting does nothing but distract much of the country from what is otherwise a concrete example of police misconduct, with what appears to be a swath of supporting evidence to boot. Further, it shows that even in a case that has produced widespread agreement in the misconduct of the officers, there are still members of the black community who will take advantage of the situation and take advantage of George Floyd's death and the tragedy that it brings to rob and destroy local businesses. There have even been reports that some of the rioters in the area now are not even from the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin City areas, but have simply traveled into town to participate in the looting and the rioting. The riots in Minneapolis, in response to what has been established to be a freak occurrence, and yet one that has bipartisan support in the view that the officers were breaking the law and demonstrated an egregious misconduct in encountering George Floyd, is reminiscent of a portion of a debate that Ben Shapiro took part in several years back, and part of the debate is clipped and been produced by several different content creators, both on YouTube and other social media platforms. And it demonstrates a general argument against the looting, the rioting, and a lot of the narrative and response you see from people on the political left, the mainstream media, and people who are generally in support of the black suspect, whether they were breaking the law or not. Now, this commentary given by Shapiro and other members of the panel was in response to a question and a prompt that not only looked to examine the civil unrest, the protests, the riots, and the general narrative regarding the state of policing in America in general, as viewed through a racial lens, but also specifically in regards to the case of a black resident of Baltimore, Maryland, Freddie Gray. If you'll remember, Frey sustained injuries to his neck and spine and eventually succumbed to those injuries while in transport in a police vehicle. So here's the relevant portion of the segment, and we'll let Shapiro take it away. And
I wanted to share with you. According to Pew Research, the net worth of white families in 2013 was $141,000. For black families, things that I wanted to share with you. According to Pew Research, the net worth of white families in 2013 was $141,000. For black families, it was $11,000, even less than the $19,000 it was in 2007. According to economist Edward Wolf of the University of New York, excluding vehicles and other durables, the median black family worth is just $1,700, while 40% of black families have zero or negative wealth. White family worth, in terms of financial worth, is 69 times more than that of black families. Given this disparity, how can you argue that racism is not a driving factor in income inequality?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't, you know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high. Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70% in the same course of time that the civil rights movement has made such tremendous strides. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? And if it is, please explain to me how that happened. I'm offended by the language of uprising applied to people who are breaking into other black people's stores and looting them. This is a lack of values, and people who are destroying private property, destroying cop cars, in an uprising against what exactly? Against the black police chief, against a mostly minority police force, against the black mayor, against the black president, against the black attorney general, against against a city council that is 9 of 15 are black and all 15 are elected Democrats. What is the uprising against? What is it seeking to achieve? I still don't see what exactly the riots are seeking to achieve. Bottom line is, this is all. It all could be boiled down to just act like a mensch. Act like a human being. Honestly, it's not useful to riot, it's not useful to break things, it's not useful to throw rocks at people. And the idea that we're supposed to sort of correlate your level of outrage.
I'm going to stick to the 30 seconds on
this.
The last
sentence. The idea that we're supposed to correlate your level of outrage with a certain level of justification. In other words, the more outraged you are and the more angry you are, the more justified you must be, is absolute nonsense.
So there you've heard an exchange and an answer by Ben Shapiro, which I'm sure many of you have heard in the past. It's a segment that's been clipped and posted quite a bit in the years since this panel discussion or debate or whatever you want to term it. And I let the beginning play there for a second because there's a primer as to the explanation and thoughts on the supposed issue of income inequality and reviewing the overall net worth of blacks versus whites, their annual income, and their overall ability to save and gain wealth in the country. But then, as you've heard in the clip, the discussion turns towards general police conduct in interaction with the Black community, and perhaps more specifically, the responses to police conduct and police conduct that is viewed as excessive, whether correctly or not. And in that case, as was noted by Ben, the rioting was happening in a locality that was almost completely 100% supervised by Black elected officials, whether it's the city council or even the police chief and some of the head detectives in charge of the police department. They were all Black. And even the few instances of non-Blacks in positions of elected power or executive power in the police department, those were elected Democrats, which further undermines the claim that there's a political divide among the parties in power as to the treatment of the Black community. And in some, you heard that, and correctly so, that those riots weren't justified because they were aimed at other Black store owners. They were aimed at Black police chiefs, at Black elected officials who, in by all available evidence, were certainly not trying to adjudicate the case of Freddie Gray in such a way to disadvantage the Black community. Similarly here, the riots in Minneapolis are in response to the Twin Cities, we'll term it, Minneapolis and St. Paul, a metropolitan area that has been dominated by Democratic and leftist control for a solid 60 years now. The city boasts a very prominent Muslim community, a very prominent African immigrant community, and the Twin Cities has been very proud of that fact in the past. They've been very public with not only the growing minority communities in the area, but also singing its own praises in terms of the racial harmony in which these different communities live in. So now the ironic turn of events that these protests are aimed at those who have, by all accounts, made it a goal to achieve racial diversity, and by many accounts have done so given the population breakdown of different communities in the area, is not only ironic in and of itself, but it also is reminiscent of similar efforts in the past, like those in Baltimore, where it seems to be an anger based in a misinterpretation of the overall state of policing in America by race more specifically, and alternatively, crime in America, and crime in America by race more specifically. The issue of crime in America will be a subject for future episodes, but we'll leave it there for now and wrap up a bow on the discussion today as far as not only the George Floyd case, but the overall state of policing in America and the different interactions and statistics that underlie the interactions that police forces see with Black communities. That wraps up this week's episode of Fate of the Union. As always, I am your host, Franklin Joseph. If you like what you heard, please subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. Please also feel free to share the podcast with any friends or family members who may be interested, as well as sharing information on the podcast on social media. You can also find the host and information on the show on Twitter or Medium by searching Franklin Joseph or Fate of the Union. And you can also reach the show's host at franklinfotu@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.